I've long wanted to come to the Faroe Islands. I'm a romantic, and anybody who's a romantic is drawn to islands. Islands have this mystical quality, and it was a very opportune invitation that Uni sent me earlier this year. And it coincided with me writing a book to complete the set of stories, which is about the blue economy and the marine part of our global economy, where many of the things I'm going to be talking about are actually being replicated in the sea. So I'd like to thank Uni for the invitation, and I also like to thank Rector Chick Collins, I hope he's here this evening, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. No one is more boring than an economist who's written a book about an important subject, or a subject that he thinks is important. So someone who's written 5 books about aspects of the same theme must be 5 times as boring. And I apologize in advance if many of you who are not economists get a little lost in the language. But I will try to make it approachable in telling the story. Let me start by recalling a little history. There's a famous book which I think all social scientists at any level should either read or be familiar with the theme, which was written in 1944 by Karl Polanyi, called The Great Transformation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And the theme of that book, in a nutshell, is that in the 19th century, in the forging of national industrial capitalism, there was a period of what he called disembeddedness, in which the economy was disembedded from society by the enthronement of a doctrine of laissez-faire, a doctrine of free market ideology. And it was dominated by financial capital. And in the process, as that domination increased, inequalities multiplied, insecurities multiplied, and you had what Karl Polanyi said was the threat of the annihilation of civilization because of those crises, which he foresaw in the terms of fascism and Bolshevism and the threat to society. He said that only if the economy was re-embedded in society with new systems of distribution, regulation, and social protection would we avoid that catastrophe. Well, in a sense, the post-1945 era of welfare state capitalism, led by the Swedish model and Beveridge and various other forms of welfare, represented that phase of the Great Transformation. But it broke down in the 1970s, long after Karl Polanyi had died, and I wrote a book about how we were entering a phase of a global transformation. And I was very privileged that Karl Polanyi's daughter wrote a glowing endorsement of that book, which made me feel that I'm sure her father would have gone along with it. Essentially, we entered a new phase in global history in which the new laissez-faire was neoliberalism, a term that way back in the 1970s we didn't use, but has come very common and everybody's heard about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism essentially was the doctrine that we should have a free market society and dismantle all the institutions of social solidarity. Again, they didn't use those terms, but that's effectively what was being done, because institutions of solidarity stand against the market. They actually don't allow market forces to have complete control. And in the process of neoliberalism led by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and the Mont Pelerin Society, which when I was a student were regarded as a bunch of right-wing cranks that we thought were part of history we laughed at, suddenly they became the dominant force in the world of economics, and no less than 8 of the original 36 members of the Mont Pelerin Society went on to receive Nobel Prizes in economics. They become hegemonic, and their doctrines spread. And their doctrines spread through liberalization of markets, allowing financial deregulation, re-regulation of labor markets in favor of capital, and in favor of particularly financial capital. So financial deregulation led to an extraordinary thrust of financialization. So much so that today, globally, financial assets are 500% or more of GDP in most OECD countries. In my own country of Great Britain, it's over 1,000%. So finance has become not just a facilitator of exchange, as the banks were meant to be, but the dominant force dictating where the investments go, how it goes, and who gets into power. So if you look around the world, Goldman Sachs, the biggest giant of Wall Street, has dominated political positions everywhere. You check up the background of prime ministers, ministers of finance, central bank governors, they've all worked for Goldman Sachs. The probability of that happening randomly is extremely small. But finance has ushered in a period when we've had a profound reorientation away from anything close to neoliberalism. So much so that, as the book, The Corruption of Capitalism, argues, we today have the most unfree market system ever conceived. It's rentier capitalism. And what rentier capitalism means is that more and more of the income goes to the owners of assets, owners of property. This is the enthronement of private property rights, so that the functional distribution of income across the world, in rich country, poor country, in China as well as in the United States, the functional income distribution has become more and more skewed, so that more and more of the income goes to the owners of capital, property, and less goes to the people who are relying on labor and work. This is a global phenomenon, not just in a certain type of country. And in the construction of rentier capitalism, the biggest single change took place in 1994 with the passage of a little piece of a legislation near where I was working in Geneva called TRIPS. And TRIPS is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property. What it means is that it globalized the United States intellectual property rights system. So that beforehand, people who had ideas, they could make money out of those ideas, but it didn't give them a commanding share of global income. Since 1995, the number of patents filed with another acronym, WIPO, which used to be a joke for it sounded like a detergent. It was a little building in Geneva where strange things went on, but it's the World Intellectual Property Organization. Today, it's the biggest building in Geneva, fabulous premises, and intellectual property rights have spread. And what it means to those who don't know anything about the subject, and you're happy not to know, I hope, is that patents, for example, give a monopoly profit to anybody who files a patent for at least 20 years. In other words, nobody else can produce that. Nobody else can sell that. If that's a free market, I'm a duck. Or a puffin, I should say, in this country. Because, of course, it isn't. It's the same with copyright. Copyright now means that anybody who has a copyright has a monopoly on the income flow for the whole of their life, plus 70 years. I don't know what they're going to do with the money, but we don't mind. And intellectual property has multiplied so that today there are something like 15 million patents in force. And what this has led to is the big corporations, big tech, big pharma, big finance, have been hoovering up patents and copyrights by buying them up from people and small firms and buying firms up so that they have a huge conglomeration. So that a big company like Google, or Alphabet as it should be called, has thousands and thousands of patents, which it strings together, which it guarantees that they get more and more billions flowing. And your plutocrats, I'll come to in a minute, are benefiting from the rent from intellectual property. Now, in addition to the extension of intellectual property in the TRIPS and so on, you've had a subject which initially I said, this is interesting, but I don't see much literature on it. And that is the plunder of the commons, which is a subject of a separate book. The commons is what belongs to all of us. The commons is the land, the sea, the air, the social institutions, our cultural institutions, our civil rights. They're all part of the commons. And we have seen that those commons have been taken away through privatization, through enclosure, through neglect, and through a neo-colonialism through financial mechanisms. We have been losing our commons. And in losing our commons, this is increasing inequalities. All through history, the common man and woman relied on access to a commons to give them the means of subsistence. No longer is that possible in most parts of the world. And the plunder of the commons has gone with a control by the rentiers of the state everywhere. So we have a new neo-mercantilist situation where countries are competing with each other through their champions, their corporate champions. And in doing so, they provide huge subsidies to those corporate champions. In your sphere of fisheries, for example, we have huge subsidies going to the big industrial fishing fleets, which are driving out the commoners in the fishing industry. That's just an example, but it's happening in all sectors. And the subsidies, of course, are highly regressive. Around the world, over 6% of national income of countries, low-income countries, rich countries, is spent on subsidies. And it's given remarkably little attention. Now, the other background contextual point, of course, is that we have been living through a new technological revolution. In the Davos that was mentioned, it's called the fourth industrial revolution, technological revolution. I think it's more like the 24th. But that it's this electronics has given power to capital, not only to get rent, but to manipulate the international division of labor. So more and more we have platform capitalism taking place, where you and me, as a worker, wherever we might be, are actually competing with people at the other side of the world in low-income countries, which are driving down the wages of people in richer countries. Because we're in a globalizing labor market, which is contributing to what I'm about to talk about. So in the process of building up rentier capitalism, we have seen that finance has been inducing more and more people to be living in debt, chronic debt. It's been leading corporations to pile themselves up with debt so that they can distribute their profits to their shareholders and their managers, which is increasing inequality. So corporate debt has risen. Private debt has risen. And because they've been cutting taxes on finance and capital, public debt has risen. Which means that whenever there's a shock, whenever there's a crisis, the international economy is much more fragile than it used to be. Which is why when COVID pandemic hit, there was automatically an international economic crisis, much, much greater than at the time of the Spanish flu 100 years ago, when millions more people actually died of the Spanish flu than of COVID. But then they didn't have a mountain of debt that made the fragility of the system. We don't have any resilience. A key point to my final argument in a few minutes. Now, in the process of the development of rentier capitalism, a new global class structure has emerged. That global class structure is not like the old Marxian class structure. I was talking with Chick at lunchtime about when I produced my book on the precariat, a lot of old Marxists attacked me as betraying the working class or something like that. We're not living in the 19th century, we're living in the 21st century. And the class structure that has emerged has a plutocracy at the top, not a 1%, but a tiny percentage of 1%, who we saw made billions and billions extra during the worst of the pandemic last year. These are global citizens with global power, and they manipulate the world economy in dramatic ways, which I've documented. Below them is an elite of multimillionaires who serve the interests of the plutocracy, and they're earning most of their money through rental forms as well. Then below them is a group I call the proficients in my book, which are people rushing around, making a hell of a lot of money. They've got their equipment over their shoulders, and they're making millions. The only problem is they suffer from burnout at approximately age 28 and a half or something like that, and take into opioids or some dramatic collapse of their lifestyle. But they exist in large numbers. Then below them is the old salariat. When I was a student, basically we were learning labor economics, that everybody by the end of the 20th century would be in the salariat. In other words, with having employment security, a pension to look forward to, paid leave, paid this, paid that. But it's shrunk everywhere. And whenever I've been to talks where I'm talking about the precariat that I'm about to talk about, there'll be some people in the audience who are part of the salariat. But they'll know the dialogue. And often they will say, I want the book for my son or my daughter, because they're not going to be joining the salariat. They'll be joining this group you're talking about. And it's below the salariat you've got the old proletariat, the one that many of my generation, we all looked to for the working class, that the welfare states were built for, the unions looked after, and collective bargaining and all the trappings of the Scandinavian model were designed to suit. They're shrinking everywhere in the world. And the old laborism of that class is also shrinking, and in my view, should shrink. Below the proletariat is the precariat. And the precariat can be defined in 3 dimensions. Often, people, particularly journalists, when they write about the precariat, they say, Stanning's just talking about people having insecure jobs. And however many times I say, that is not what we're talking about, there'll be at least one person who leaves the room saying, Stanning's just talking about people who have insecure jobs. The first thing is that people in the precariat have distinctive relations of production, What that means is, yes, they're living bits and pieces lives. They don't have an occupational narrative or identity to give to their lives. They're having to do a lot of work for labor, work that is unrecognized, unremunerated, and not represented in statistical terms or in textbooks or in the language of work. And they tend to be doing work as labor that is below the level of their education. They are living unstable, insecure lives, but that is only one dimension of it, which is very stressful, and that's a key part of the precariat. But the second dimension is this, that people in the precariat have distinctive relations of distribution. What this means is they have to rely on money wages that are uncertain, fluctuate, and are falling in real terms. And for the first time in history, we have a mass class that is being exploited more off the workplace and outside labor time than inside workplaces and inside labor time. And mainly that is in the form of incurring huge debts. If you are in the precariat, you are living on the edge of unsustainable debt all the time. And finance wants you to be in debt. It's the way it makes its money. But in addition, you are losing non-wage benefits that the salariat took for granted. You are losing entitlement to rights-based state benefits. So all over the world, you see people drifting into what I call a denizen status rather than a citizen status, even in their own country. And that leads to the third dimension, which is the most important. It is the fact that if you're in the precariat, you have a distinctive relation to the state. And what that means is you are losing the rights of a citizen. You don't have civil rights, being treated as an equal in the legal system. You don't have social rights. You don't have economic rights. You don't have political rights because you don't see in the political spectrum parties or politicians representing your aspirations and your interests. And in the process, and this is the most important aspect of being in the precariat, you are reduced to being a supplicant. The original Latin root of precariousness is to obtain by prayer. If you're in the precariat, you feel you have to rely on people doing you favors. You have to rely on asking for people to make discretionary judgments in your favor rather than in somebody else's favor. You have to be obsequious in seeking out favors. If you think of it as humiliation, which is institutionalized and can be very well documented as something that is spreading through the state, through corporate activities, through the financiers, and so on. Now, in the process, what we've seen is that the precariat emerged as what Marxians would say is a class in the making, not yet a class for itself. What that means is that it has internal divisions. When I wrote The Precariat in 2011, I said on page 1 that unless the interests, insecurities, and aspirations of the precariat were addressed, we would see the emergence of a political monster. At the beginning of 2016, I was making some pasta or something in the kitchen, and I got an email, and it invited me to the Bilderberg group to go and give a talk on the precariat. I thought it was some sort of lefty friend of mine who was trying to make a joke and make me feel stupid. So I didn't answer. 2 days later, I got a phone call in my home we sent you an email. We are the Bilderberg Group. We sent you an email. And I said, well, look, I thought it was a joke. And the Bilderberg Group was set up in 1954, and it consists of the world's elite, wealthy, politically connected group in the world. I thought, this is crazy. Why are they inviting me? I consulted all my left friends across Europe, and every single one of them said, Guy, you must go. You must go. And I said, oh, all right. I expected to be roasted alive. So imagine then comes April 2016. I'm flown VIP treatment and taken to Bremen and taken to a castle. There are hundreds of demonstrators outside the castle. We're all armed police and armed guards everywhere. And the next morning, I'm standing like this, talking to 100 people in the world, the 100 most right-wing people you could name. And right where you're sitting, right there, taking notes, was Henry Kissinger. Now, I thought the whole lot of them would run for the bar as soon as I started talking about the precariat. In fact, they all stayed, all 100 of them, including 2 kings, 3 ministers of finance, 4 prime ministers. The whole lot, it would just be bizarre. It's like a surrealistic dream that I was having, talking to these people. And I said this. I said, look, part of the precariat are the atavists, the people who feel they've lost their past. They had a past of a working class life with a sense of dignity, a sense of belonging, a sense of community, and it's gone. This group wants the past back. This group will be voting this summer for Donald Trump and for Brexit. And do not be surprised if both those things happen. Fortunately for my story, everything was recorded, so I can demonstrate it. The second thing I said, the second group in the precariat are the nostalgics. These are the people who've lost a present. They don't have a home anywhere. They've come from somewhere that isn't their home. They've come to somewhere else that isn't their home. This group won't vote for the neo-fascists, but they won't vote. They'll be basically disenfranchised. And this is happening to millions and millions of people who are ceasing to be citizens, but are part of the precariat and are occasionally taking part in days of rage. I happened to give a talk shortly after the days of rage around Stockholm took place, which many of you will remember, and happened in Tottenham, in London, shortly after my book came out. And I said the third group in the precariat are the young educated, going to college, going to university, and their parents and their teachers said, if you do that, you will get a future. And they're coming out of university and college without a future. And they know it. And they're angry. They won't vote for Donald Trump or Brexit or any neo-fascist. They're looking for a new politics of paradise. They're looking for a new progressive politics, and they won't be voting for the Social Democrats, who are promising a version of yesterday. And they will not be supporting the labor unions. Often if I'm talking to a group of the precariat and I start talking about the unions, many people will want to go to the bar to escape because they say they don't represent us. I say that with sadness because I'm a union supporter. Now, what has happened since 2016 is part of the good news. Part of it is this. I believe the size of the atavistic part of the precariat has peaked. They're getting older. They're getting into a minority of the precariat. The progressive part is growing. And this progressive part is taking part in the Extinction Rebellion, is taking part in the movement that I'm about to conclude with. and is looking for a new politics of paradise. And contrary to certain characters who think the precariat can't mobilize because it can't have a solidarity base, I disagree with that, because more and more people feel that they belong to the precariat. Or if they don't belong to it, they can identify with the insecurities and the aspirations that people in the precariat hold today. Now, this sense of anger, I wouldn't expect to be strong here. What I would hope is that in small countries like yours, you can get a sense of empathy with what's happening globally. And that leads to the final part of my talk. For over 40 years, really, it does show some stamina, I suppose, I've been promoting a basic income as an economic right for everybody. I believe it should be the basis of any good society in the 21st century, that everybody should have a right to subsistence and a right to live in the commons. And this is a matter of common justice, first and foremost. The income and wealth of every single person in this room and any other room is far more to do with the efforts and achievements of the many, many generations before us than anything we do ourselves. And if we allow for private inheritance of private wealth, shouldn't we allow for the shared dividends from our public wealth? It's also a matter of religious justice. And I was so pleased that the Pope finally came out in favor of basic income last year, because he understands that if there's a God, I'm not religious, but if there's a God, then he gives unequal talents. And a basic income is, in a sense, a compensation to those who don't have the talent of making money and being successful. A basic income would also enhance freedom. It would enhance libertarian freedom, the freedom to say no, and the freedom to say yes, the freedom to make choices. It also enhances liberal freedom. Liberal freedom is the chance to be moral. You can only be moral if you are free to make decisions without doing so out of necessity or coercion. That is liberal freedom. But most importantly, it's about republican freedom, which means the freedom from potential domination by people in unaccountable positions of power. If a woman has to ask her husband if she can do X, Y, or Z, even if she knows that 99% of the time he's going to say yes, that's not real freedom. Freedom means that she will be able to make that decision herself without fear of anything. It's her decision. And it also gives basic security. Basic security is a human need. It's also a public good. You having basic security doesn't deprive me of having basic security. And if we all have basic security, the value to all of us rises. And psychologists have taught us that basic security is needed for our IQ. If you are chronically insecure, your mental capacities drop. Your ability to make moral decisions drop. We need basic security. Now, today we have a situation where inequalities are multiplying, insecurities are multiplying, the prekariat is growing, and we have the threat of the annihilation of civilization. There will be a cleverer Donald Trump down the road. We need a new income distribution which will enable us to do more work and less labor, more care work, which is undervalued in all our societies, more voluntary work, more slowing down. We need a slow time movement. In a sense, that sort of vision of a good society is going to be closer to what island economies have nurtured over history. A sense of commoning, a sense of ecological respect, a closeness to nature. And the precariat knows that this must be part of this progressive politics of tomorrow. That is why I have been enormously touched, on this I'll conclude, by the fact that in the past year since the pandemic struck, I've been asked to do over 100 Zooms, and the group Massive Attack asked me to do a video. I never thought I'd make a pop song in my life. I never had aspirations, and I was enormously pleased that I did it because it's had nearly 500,000 views in English and in German as well, and in Spanish and Italian. So it's passed the message. And the message I want to end on is this. A good society relies on the resilience of all of us. If any group in society is left unresilient, we will all be unresilient. That's what basic income is about. Thank you.